This is Equip and Engage, a podcast by Subsplash, exploring how ministry, technology, and innovation come together to equip churches around the world to engage their communities. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Equip and Engage. I'm Carolyn Farney, a ministry consultant here at Subsplash, and I'm joined here with Nick Bogardus, VP of Marketing at Subsplash. How's it going, Nick?
It's going great, Carolyn. It's good to be here. Our interview today is incredibly timely right now, with so much of our public discourse being kind of centered on issues of censorship and free speech and religious liberty, the Constitution, and like massive important topics like that. We really wanted to bring in someone who knows what they're talking about and how they can splice the significance between all those different issues helpfully for us. So we brought in Brad Littlejohn, and he's going to guide our thinking on these topics from a historical and scriptural perspective. And he's going to help us offer something meaningful to pastors who are wondering how to navigate this cultural moment.
That's right. And there's also a question around benefits and drawbacks of using social media and other big tech platforms for ministry. And in my role here with Subsplash, I've had these conversations with churches all the time. So, question for you, why is Brad the right person to help unpack these things with us?
Well, Brad is a scholar of Reformation history, Christian ethics, and political theology. His work as the founder and the president of the Davenant Institute is focused on helping Christians have confidence that their convictions are rationally grounded in reality, history, and scripture. And he's also interested in helping Christians serving in government and public policy pursue justice through the wisdom of classical Protestant ethical and political theory. And all of his work is especially relevant to developing a fully thought out theology of free speech and religious liberty, which I think is much needed for pastors today.
Absolutely. And Brad had a lot of wisdom to share here. So let's go ahead and dive in. Hi, welcome, Brad. It's great to meet you. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. As we dive in, and really, I wanted to start on a personal note, as I've been watching the headlines and today's political landscape, there seems to be just a lot of conversation around free speech. Not only free speech, but censorship, cancel culture, even the Constitution itself. And turns out these are all fundamentally related to each other. And really, that's one of the reasons we wanted to add your voice to this conversation, was to hear from a Christian theological perspective, how we can start thinking through some of this stuff as leaders in the church. So to start off with, maybe as we take it down to the foundations, what or how or why is religious liberty a human and constitutional right?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing to note is that the idea of religious liberty and the idea of freedom of speech are certainly closely interwoven. I would say, there's a Venn diagram where they have a large overlap. There's certainly freedom of speech that is not religious speech, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And there's freedom of religious freedom that is more than just freedom of speech. But I would say, kind of the historical core of religious freedom, I'd say religious freedom kind of has had three different layers. And the innermost layer, the core, which really was foundational in the development of free speech more generally, was the idea of free religious speech, the freedom to proclaim the truth of the gospel as Christians understood it. And I say the gospel specifically because this kind of religious freedom emerged in a Christian culture, and really particularly became an issue after the Reformation, where you had different visions of Christianity. So, really going off of Acts 4, where Peter and John say to the council, we must obey God rather than men. That's specifically in the context of this freedom to preach, right? Saying it's not freedom per se. It's we are bound. We have to obey God, right? We are free in relation to man because we're not free in relation to God. We have to speak this truth, and we're going to do it. And so societies recognized, if people feel a compulsion before God to preach, maybe we should just let them. Maybe we should let them do that, even if we don't agree with them. We're going to do more harm than good by trying to stop them. So this freedom of religious speech becomes foundational to the development of the modern West. The second level of religious freedom beyond that would be freedom of worship, freedom to actually organize churches and worship in a way consistent with your understanding of the truth. That develops somewhat more slowly in general than the freedom of religious speech. And then the third, which is perhaps the most complicated, is freedom of religious practice. That would be outside of the domain of worship, specifically the freedom to live out your convictions in various areas of life. But I mean, even worship could pose some issues in terms of, if your beliefs are, if your view of worship includes the right of human sacrifice, then there might be, that might not be a freedom that you should enjoy in a modern society. That doesn't really come up, thankfully. But when you get to freedom of action more generally, freedom to act on your convictions, you can run into conflicts there. And we're seeing that even today with like religious exemptions for vaccines.
So you've already touched a hot topic in vaccines right out of the gate. And so before we move on, I do want to kind of maybe ask two questions to set the table. And that is, like, what's at stake here? What's at stake if people who are listening aren't kind of concerned about these topics? And secondly, can you help us maybe delineate between the freedom of religious truth and religious worship and practice and a general freedom of speech?
The problem is there are issues at stake in both directions, and they're big issues. And so people get passionate about it, but in potentially opposite directions. So I would say, in the one direction, the concern is, for instance, someone would say, well, vaccines may not be a central issue, but if I'm not allowed to, if I don't have freedom of my religious convictions when it comes to vaccines, then it's a slippery slope. So people say we kind of need to draw the lines as far out as we can, because that's the best way to defend kind of the central citadel of Christian truth. But on the other hand, I think what could be at stake in the opposite direction is there's a danger that if Christians assert their religious freedom and their rights to speech and action over things that are not, in fact, matters of Christian conviction or historic Christian teaching, there's a danger that we kind of we're the boy who cried wolf. We complain to the secular society, you're taking away our freedom, our religious freedom, on something that's not actually a religious issue, and then we lose the credibility to stand up for religious freedom when it really is a religious issue. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of drawing that distinction, I think one thing I want to say out of the starting gate mm-hmm. is I think there's been a dangerous slippage in our rhetoric about these things where any opinion that I have almost can be elevated to the level of religious conviction. Mm-hmm. And there may be there's legitimate, there are good reasons to protect difference of opinion, but we shouldn't baptize every difference of opinion with the kind of sacred status of a religious conviction. And historically, I mean, and one way to do that is simply to say, if you're going to assert a belief or conviction that you have to act in a certain way, or you shouldn't act in a certain way, then it should be grounded in some historic teaching of some historic Christian community. If this is what you think and you have strong feelings about it, but no Christian denomination has ever taught this, then maybe that's not a Christian religious liberty issue. It might, it may be another different kind of freedom issue. But I do think we need to sort of distinguish that for Christians, we do have, there are certainly plenty of differences of opinion within the church. There are different denominational traditions, and yet it's not anything goes. You can't just sort of say it shouldn't be, whatever I feel like, I'm going to sort of say, well, that's the Spirit speaking to me, and therefore that's my religious belief, and therefore Christianity is under assault, if you don't let me do that thing. So I think there is an important, I think it's important to have historic creeds and confessions, and to be familiar with the historic teachings of the church, so you can say, well, this is actually an issue on which Christians have made some, strong testimony, and I'm going to stand up for that. And then this is an issue in which I might have strong feelings, but they're not really backed up by a longer Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm. And then can you delineate between the, just a general freedom of speech and a freedom of religious assembly or practice? How would we think about those without conflating them completely together, right? Like what's that space between?
I mean, the first test would be, is it something proclaimed in the scriptures? So I want freedom to speak on this topic. Freedom to espouse, certain views about, appropriate taxation policy. Okay, I might have strong views about that. And I hope that I live in a society where I have the freedom to speak up on those matters. But obviously that's not a religious freedom issue, because my views on tax policy don't have any biblical passage that I'm pointing to. I mean, as a Christian, I want to be informed by scripture in terms of scriptural principles and all of the views that I develop. But a lot of the views that I will hold on a lot of the topics of the day are going to go well beyond what has been affirmed in scripture or what has been historically affirmed in the teaching of the Christian church, of the Christian churches, right?
Yeah, and maybe even diving in on the freedom of speech issue from just a historical context. How did we get to that point? And there's the religious liberty that we were talking about, and then the freedom of speech. So as an historical context, I know for me, I hear it, whether it's friends that, are proclaimed Christians, love Jesus, or on the total opposite end, there is a drumbeat for freedom of speech. So what's some historical context for that?
Yeah, well, I think it has, first thing to note is I think there are two very different impulses that have kind of come together to create our modern freedom of speech. And it's important that we distinguish them. So the first would be, one would be freedom of speech as kind of a positive good. And then I'll talk about where that comes from. And the other would simply be freedom of speech as the result of the limits of government power. And here's what I want to say, right? That there are, in every society at all times, there are things that most everybody in the society grants are bad, that are nonetheless permitted by law, or maybe they're officially forbidden by law, but in reality, they're permitted because nobody enforces the rules against them. And that's just because, short of a totalitarian society, which none of us want to live in, you can't get rid of every evil thing in the society without doing more harm than good, right? So, I mean, actually, even in medieval society, Thomas Aquinas, the sort of high point of Catholic Christianity says, yeah, you probably need to legalize prostitution because it's just not, you can do more harm than good by trying to crack down on prostitution. So libel laws, something like libel fits into this category. So libel is, publishing lies about someone else. Now, this used to be illegal and heavily prosecuted, but eventually, once publishing and print media proliferated so much, and particularly in the age of online media, there's so much stuff being published by so many people about so many things that people are just lying all the time. And basically, the society said, you know what? It's impossible to police all this stuff. And if somebody publishes a lie about you, just deal with it, just sort of man up and deal with it. Don't sue them for libel. I mean, there still are libel suits you still can do it in particular circumstances, but sort of in general, we tolerate a lot of bad speech just as a result of not being able to police it. So there's that toleration of the bad part of free speech. And then there's the positive permission of the good in terms of the good side of free speech. And that, I think, has two distinct elements in it. And I'll try to be concise here. But one is the religious element. So historically, freedom of speech as a societal good comes partly from that religious freedom side of things, and the realization that it's important for, even if there is only one true religion, people are going to disagree about what that is. They're not going to necessarily have, they're not going to have a commonly agreed upon standard that they can appeal to resolve those disputes. So you're going to have people with deeply held convictions that they think they have a responsibility before God, and those convictions differ. And in fact, it's good. It's a good thing. You want, in the area of religion, sincerity matters, right? You don't just want people just sort of going with the flow just because, right? And so a society in which different religious views are allowed to proclaim themselves and to try to persuade is one in which you will have sincerity of religious belief instead of merely nominal religious belief, in which people are going along because, you know, they're going to be persecuted if they do something else, right? And so sincerity of religious belief is good, therefore freedom of religious speech is good. The other area in which freedom of speech is good, clearly, is in the political arena, in which, look, you want a well-governed country, there's going to be differences of opinion about how to get there. And if you stifle those differences and every difference is treated as disloyalty, then you're going to have a much more poorly governed country. And so you originally have, in the English Parliament, you have freedom of speech within Parliament, maybe not anywhere else, but within Parliament, you can say what you want because it's important to have free debate there. And that gradually expands outward into, you know, political newspapers are allowed to publish different viewpoints and so on. And so at the time of the US Constitution, that those two things have become pretty deeply entrenched. This idea that it's a good thing to have freedom of debate on political matters, and it's a good thing to have free proclamation of religious convictions. And that's really where the constitutional right of freedom of speech comes from. At that time, they're not necessarily envisioning that as a sort of universal right to, you know, free to say what you want on whatever. Like, actually, at that time, things like libel laws were tightly policed. You know, if you published false things about somebody, you could have your newspaper shut down.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where sometimes it feels like issues we experience today are totally new, you know, as we're thinking through, okay, is Facebook or YouTube or, you know, are these different giants starting to, you know, censor what certain groups say, and how should we think about this? But what, even as you look historically at this, and specifically like what we can learn from people like the reformers, or just throughout history as we've seen kind of different generations wrestle with this same thing?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most important things we can learn from our Christian past is, you know, our modern language of, well, even the language of freedom. I mean, the classic text is Luther's Freedom of a Christian, in which he says the Christian is the most free Lord of all, and the Christian is the most dutiful servant of all. So freedom is always, at the same time, for the Christian, freedom is bondage. Freedom is bondage to, we are bondservants of God, as the language of the New Testament uses. And we, as bondservants of God, we are supposed to serve God make ourselves servants of one another. So that language of freedom is always tied in with service. We are freed for the purpose of service. And similarly, we use the language of, I would say, in contrast, nowadays, we often just think about the kind of negative side of it. We are free, we're freed from oppression, freed from people telling us what to do, and we never really emphasize that other side of it, freed to serve. Similarly, we use this language of rights that's really deep in our vocabulary and our psychology now, is this language of rights. Historically, though, the idea of rights was always paired with the idea of duties. The reason you had a right was actually because you first had a duty. Like God, God put Adam in the world to do certain things. And he put all of Adam's offspring into the world to do certain things, to serve him and to serve one another. And therefore, you need to have enough rights to be able to carry out those duties. So, for instance, something like freedom of speech. God, what's the first thing that Adam does, right? He's put there to name the creatures. He's supposed to name the world around him. So, rightly, when I would sort of generalize that is sort of that's the scriptural proof text for the scientific endeavor. Like, we are supposed to describe the world around us and rightly describe what it is God has made. And we have a duty to do that. And because we have a duty to do that, then we need to have a right to do it, right? If you stifle the progress of science, if you don't let people, like the Catholic Church didn't let Galileo publish his observations, that is depriving him that is making it impossible for him to carry out his God-given duty of being like Adam and naming the planets, right? And so our rights of free speech, our earlier generations would have understood that our rights of free speech are there to enable us to carry out the duties that speech is for, right? The duties of rightly naming the world, of rightly preaching the word, etc.
So Brad, you're talking about rights, and I think something that's kind of in the background in your description is that my understanding is historically rights were God-given. They were from an external source, right? And I don't know how familiar you are with like Jonathan Haidt's work or Carl Trueman's work, and they both kind of traced that over time, any kind of external reference point has become more subjective, either through psychology or all of the individual identities that kind of are popping up everywhere. And so an external reference point for our rights has become internalized into like therapeutic demands or needs.
Right.
And that's not to say that Christians have in all times and places done a great job of allowing for religious freedom or freedom of speech, because I'm sure there are tons of instances where we have not done that. But I'm curious how you would talk about freedom of speech and religious liberty. What are the consequences on those things from an external reference point being kind of truncated down to the self?
The initial result is going to be a kind of libertine explosion. I don't know that that's actually the final result, and I'll get back to that. But if rights are just subjective, they're based on my feelings. I feel like this, and therefore I feel, therefore I am, right? And so I have a right to act on that feeling. Then what you have is you have increasingly the breakdown in any common reference point for. I think what we see in terms of profound political polarization now is in some ways the result of this. We don't have a common reference point as a society at all in terms of any sense of shared duties, any sense of things that we're supposed to sacrifice for one another. Like the idea of a sort of common will to actually achieve any kind of common purpose isn't there anymore. And you also get society you give up any attempt to distinguish between good speech and bad speech, between edifying speech and unedifying speech. In fact, the 1960s is where you have the beginning kind of abandoning the effort to put obscenity outside the boundaries of free speech. And so you have the explosion of pornography and all of the harm that is doing to society now. It's being done under the heading of free speech, which it's kind of ridiculous to treat the dissemination of pornographic images as a form of speech. If you think that historically, freedom of speech was about like freedom of political deliberation, but that's where we are. But I would say we're at the cusp of potentially a backlash, which is to say, however individualist we might be, there's a deep, we're wired for community of some kind. And we tend to, it's easy for kind of we can be prone to kind of a mass psychology where we actually subsume our individuality within a kind of collective hysteria or collective righteous zeal or whatever it may be. And if indeed everything is subjective, then you can have just kind of the will of society as a whole, the feelings of society as a whole, become the barometer of what rights there should and shouldn't be. And that's, I think, what we're in danger of now of getting to, which is actually a kind of totalitarian reaction against our kind of libertine explosion. Or it's kind of weird. It's like a totalitarianism on behalf of libertinism in a way. I mean, the idea that society is now saying any attempt to interfere with anybody's freedom of sexual identity is absolutely intolerable and has to be stifled, right? You can't appeal anymore to an objective standard of rights to justify your freedom to dissent, because rights are simply now created by the kind of collective psyche.
Yeah, it reminds me of something I think David Wells at Gordon Conwell said. He said, like, in the absence of any objective truth or reality, all that's left is power, politics, and persuasion. And that's kind of what I hear in your description. And like, without any external framework, it's just coming down to who's the 51% over the 50%.
Yeah. Well, and I would leave persuasion out of that, because I would say persuasion, the concept of persuasion assumes some kind of appeal to rational norms. I think we're losing that. So.
Before we get back to our conversation with Brad, I want to acknowledge that pastors are in such a tough spot right now. With the onset of the pandemic, many churches went from relatively low tech to fully online almost overnight. Churches have been scrambling to stay connected and leveraging any and every tool available. Even if you have been able to share your message without interruption, online environments like Facebook and YouTube are full of distractions that ultimately point people away from your mission. That's why Subsplash Media is the #1 live streaming and on-demand media solution for churches. Now you can host, play, and share your sermon videos, audio recordings, music, podcasts, and more. You can even live stream high-quality broadcasts to your app, website, and social channels. With no ads, auto-updated content, and fully customizable media player, we've made it simple to keep gospel-centered content in front of your community. Our team would love to help your church overcome distraction and disconnection through a powerful platform that's built for ministry from the ground up. To get started with Subsplash Media today, visit us at subsplash.com/free speech. That's subsplash.com/free speech. And now, back to the podcast.
So I'm curious, right? Because I think there's a common argument I hear, which is basically like an appeal to free speech in light of my tribe or my point of view, but not freedom of speech for those I disagree with. Right? Something interesting that you've written is that in order to secure our moral right to speak truth, we generally need to defend a legal right that includes a right to speak falsehood. And so if this is the case, I mean, how do we determine where the line is? How do we maintain that balance?
There's a couple of things going on here. One is simply the recognition that in the absence of shared criteria for agreeing on truth, the right to proclaim your understanding of truth is going to have to involve, there's going to be other people who have another understanding of things, and you don't have any authority that you can appeal to resolve that per se. And so if you could seize the levers of power and establish freedom for your group to say what you think and silence them, but that only lasts as long as you hold the levers of power. And then if you lose the levers of power, they're probably going to take vengeance and try to silence you. So it's so you have a sort of live and let live, where you say, look, I think that what these people are saying is complete tripe, but I if I try to silence them, then I run the risk of, them silencing me later, right? So that's kind of the classical liberal argument for why we allow freedom of speech, which is just to say that it's almost a kind of self-protective measure for ourselves to have the right to speak truth as we understand it. We have to give other people the right to speak truth as they understand it. And I think that's a valid argument up to a point. I think there's also, there's a stronger argument too to be made, which is that truth stays sharp by having falsehood to reckon with. That it's interesting that the church throughout a lot of its history has been pretty quick to use the civil authority to try to crack down on heretics and silence them, and yet that if it had been altogether successful, we'd be a lot worse off, because it was the existence of heretics and their at least some freedom to say what they thought and publish what they thought that allowed Orthodox Christians to define more clearly what the truth was and to defend it better and to articulate it more clearly, right? So the best articulation of truth is only going to emerge in conflict with falsehood. And so there needs to be some space for people to say false things in a society in order for the truth to be sharpened up. I do think there's the flip side of that is, as Mark Twain once said, that a lie can travel halfway around the world while truth is still lacing up its bootstraps. And he said that before social media, right? Now it's like lie can travel around the world several thousand times. And so I think we are in a situation where that classic defense of, yes, there's error out there, but that gives space for truth to articulate itself better, and you have a kind of iron sharpening iron thing. That does require certain boundaries. You sort of like your ideal mental image of that is, almost kind of like a college debating hall, where it's like, okay, this person's gonna articulate this view and this person's gonna articulate that view. And most of us think that view is bad, but we want to give them a chance to say it so that we can, sharpen up our understanding. But, that works if you have somebody recognized, two views defined only and a recognized speaker for each side. If you had a college debating hall with 1,000 people and everyone just speaking up at once and yelling, that's not gonna lead to the illumination of truth. And that's a little bit more where we are now, right? Where it's not one falsehood, it's 1,000 different falsehoods potentially competing for airtime. And that doesn't actually lead to truth coming into sharper focus, I don't think. And sometimes, in fact, there are immediate, near and clear harms that can be done by false speech. The classic yelling fire in a crowded theater. The courts have said you don't have freedom to say something that is going to cause real life harm before anybody has a chance to correct it. So now, what do you do about that in a time when, what is the solution? I don't think there is there are no easy solutions. I think we have digital media is here to stay, and there's a totalitarian solutions where you do actually have like maybe in China, where you have powers of censorship that are enough to try to stifle some of the falsehoods, but in with doing much more harm than good. So I do think at the very least, though, we need to name the problem. We shouldn't. We can't kid ourselves by saying, "Oh, this is great. We just have so much freedom of opinion out there, and it means that more and more truth is coming to light." It doesn't mean more truth is coming to light, because, as I said, if everybody's yelling at the same time, that doesn't lead to any clarification of the discussion. I think it does mean the church needs to really. We can't change the world around us. We're not going to destroy Twitter or whatever, but the church needs to think about the kinds of media that it uses and the kinds of fora for communication that it uses, And the church needs to try to create spaces of thoughtful, orderly disagreement, spaces in which there's not so much speech going on that nobody can hear each other think, right? And I think that means, perhaps the church being more intentional about when and where and how it uses some of these tools of mass media.
I kind of segueing from there, I think, you'd mentioned the totalitarian control of a society like China. But I mean, it's not like huge American companies don't have significant influence, insight, penetration, manipulation into our lives, right? Like when I do a Google search, I get returns based on what they know about me. When I search on Amazon, they know what I'm going to buy 6 months ahead of time. Like there is a knowledge of who I am that is more than some of my best friends, right? So it's not a totalitarian in a gray suit with a red hat. It's a capitalistic kind of control, right? So one of the problems that I think a lot of churches are facing is how do we navigate that world well, right? Especially coming out of 2020, where now churches have to basically live in a hybrid world, like simultaneously in person and online. And a lot of those online tools are controlled by those very companies that have that level of control. How can churches think about the tools that they choose to use and what the potential consequences are of those, particularly on free speech for our conversation?
Yeah. So I think this is a huge issue that we have to reckon with in the present. And I think, Christians in some ways are reaping some of the fruit of several decades of, sloppy political theory in which we thought, as long as something happens in the private sector, it's got to be good for freedom, right? No, I mean, we now have a private sector in certain fields, and in big tech at least, that is, as monopolistic. It's extremely monopolistic. It's a massive amount of concentrated power, and it has in some domains the power of the full powers that a government would have, and it's saying to itself, well, maybe we should use these powers. I mean, and not in a, now we can get them, we got all these rats in the laboratory. I mean, to some extent, they do actually use this as rats in the laboratory to make money. But sometimes the worst stuff is where they're actually trying to act for the public interest. They're saying, wow, there are lots of horrible, people are sharing, it started with people are sharing videos of torturing cats or whatever on Facebook, and, we shouldn't let them do that. We need to censor that. Okay. Yeah. That's coming back to my point about not all speech, certainly not all images are good and edifying. But, then it comes to, well, people are saying offensive things. They're saying something gets to they're posting pro-life content, and that's offensive. It's offensive to pro-choice people, and they flag it as offensive, and it gets taken down. So that's them now trying to exercise the powers of a sovereign without the accountability that at least in the West, governments that have exercised those kinds of powers have mechanisms of accountability, not perfect mechanisms of accountability, but they are accountable to the public. These companies aren't accountable to the public. And so you have, I think, a very dangerous political situation where you have private entities representing private interests trying to take action on behalf of the public without any real mechanism of public input or accountability. And I think this requires some serious thought at a political level about, what do we need to do to limit the power of these companies or make it more transparent, more accountable to democratic procedures. And I think this is an interesting place where the right and left can work together. I think for a long time, the left had people on the left were concerned about monopolistic capitalism, surveillance capitalism, for reasons that a person on the left would be. And for a while, people on the right were like, oh no, it's private companies, free market, they're doing their thing, they're generating value, so it's good. And now many people on the right have woken up to the fact that no, these companies are not your friends, and this is unaccounted. This is way too much concentrated power. So I think there could be some interesting political developments happening there. But in the church, I think one thing we may need to do is we need to be encouraging young Christian entrepreneurs to think about using their skills to develop platforms and tools that remain small and independent, and that are able, that churches will, if Zoom decides that we're not going to allow any church services to go over Zoom that violate our non-discrimination policy or whatever, that there's a great alternative to Zoom that's been developed, that Christians can use, the Chick-fil-A of internet technology or whatever. I think that's what we do have to be looking towards as Christians in the modern West.
Yeah, I think I one argument that some people have made for live streaming through YouTube or Facebook is we want to reach people where they are. I think there's some validity to that. The majority of our population are on these platforms, and it's an easy way to reach people. But I think sometimes churches and church leaders don't ask about, well, what are the other implications of that? Whether that is, exposing people to ads or content on those platforms, that's probably not great. But also then bringing the members of your church into an ecosystem that exists to that's not there for their benefit.
Right.
But then there's also, we at Subsplash, we've heard from clients who have live streamed on Sundays through those channels and been shut down on Easter Sunday or things like that for talking about Jesus, crucifixion, resurrection. Uncontroversial Christian doctrines, and have been shut down during a live stream for those things. And so I think there's something to think about there for churches for sure, because my sense is it's coming. More of that is coming. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think for sure. And at this point, the impetus is largely coming from private companies. In Canada, there you have more that's, I don't know the details of it, but you have laws being passed that are really limiting the ability of churches to speak out without violating certain non-discrimination rules and so on. That could happen. It seems to me we have such effective, in many ways, the kind of progressive state in the US has outsourced a lot of its police functions to these private companies, and it may remain that way. Congress doesn't need to pass something curtailing churches' freedom if Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and so on are doing it for them. But the nice thing is, if it's happening, at least if it's happening through the private sphere, it may be difficult, but with a concerted effort, it's possible to develop alternative platforms, alternative tools. And I think that's why, we do need entrepreneurial minded Christians who are creating spheres, ecosystems of Christian friendly technology, that, yes, if push really comes to shove and, we have a government that's so hostile that it wants to silence us, then they could shut down, Christian YouTube or whatever it is. But that would require much more of a frontal assault than what they're now doing, which is, kind of surreptitious and sneaky. So I think at least we're a few decades away from that kind of showdown.
Yeah, and that kind of leads in. I love the thought around it's this is why monopolies kind of end not great for the people, because it's helpful to have more voices And in, like you were saying, kind of more companies that enter the market, and hence, I mean, even Subsplash. And this is kind of why we do what we do, is saying, hey, we have a core conviction around, seeing the truth of Jesus be accessible to all people, and that great commission to go and make disciples. And we believe that, the hope for that for humanity is through the local church. And so and this kind of leads in a couple of weeks, we're interviewing another guest, Joe Carter, on a similar topic around censorship and the church. And just as we kind of wrap this up and get in the mindset for that conversation, love to get your take on that question. I know you're kind of, touching on it a little bit there, but do you think the church is being censored?
I would say yes, to some extent. I would say, I would say there are people out there who are probably too complacent about this, who are like, oh no, nonsense, and they need to wake up and realize, no, this is real. On the other hand, I think it's also easy to get into a kind of paranoid mindset where you're sort of spotting censorship around every corner, and you see, this sort of coordinated campaign of they're out to get us. And it's not generally that coordinated, it's this, content moderation officer at Facebook, and this, so it's different people in different places abusing their power. And, it's a country of 330 million people. I don't know how many tens of thousands of churches there are. And it's every one of those stories may get magnified. And so you hear a bunch of stories and you think, oh man, this is like, we're just like in bunker mode, it's basically Soviet Russia. And it's like, no, it's not. It's still, 99% of the churches, 99% of the time are still free to preach what they want. But that might be 98% next year. It might be, so I think it is real. I think it's increasing. I do think there's a danger of sensationalism where we all love the persecution complex is a real thing. And it goes all the way back to the early church where, you had people who were sort of voluntarily putting themselves forward and getting thrown to the lions because they wanted to be martyred. And the church fathers were like, no, that's not martyrdom. If you're sort of, and I think there are Christians now who sometimes, I think this is the danger we have to be on guard against, is people who put themselves forward, say offensive things, or, I think this has been an issue in the pandemic of, churches that are refusing to comply with even very reasonable requests and saying, okay, I'm going to make a big statement of refusing to wear a mask or whatever, and then I'm going to get persecuted, and I'm going to make sure that it's streamed, on YouTube, me getting persecuted, right? And I know what the church fathers would say about that. So I think we have to be alive to the problem. On the other hand, we need not to be so eager to don the mantle of the persecuted that we imagine the problem or we create the problem where it doesn't yet exist. I think, if we are faithfully proclaiming the truth of Jesus, conflict and persecution will come. We don't need to sort of actively create that for purposes of, rallying the troops. We can, be patient and wait for our faithfulness to generate that opposition.
Brad, I think there's a real challenge here for pastors, and one that I felt myself as a pastor for the last 11 years, and particularly in the last 18 to 24 months. And that is that many pastors feel like they simply can't win. I mean, it's kind of been a feeling for a while, but it absolutely gotten, pressurized in the last political and social season. No matter what a pastor says, they can't come out on the other side of the issue without taking hits, right? What advice would you give to pastors who feel like they have to walk on eggshells with all the hot button headline issues of masks, no masks, vaccines, no vaccines, immigration, open borders, BLM, justice? I mean, all that stuff, right? what advice would you have to them?
I think the best thing that pastors can do for their congregations at this moment in our history is to try to broaden their historical perspective. And I don't just say, of course, I'm a historian, I would say that, right? But here's the reason it's so important. It's not just people like, oh, you can glean some useful insights from history. How did they do it before? We can learn from that now. But it's getting them outside of, I think it's weird that in a way we live in a more connected world than ever before. We should have wider horizons than we've ever had. And yet I feel like many people have their horizons. It's like we're actually overwhelmed by that, right? We're just exposed to way too many different viewpoints and too much information. And so people respond by kind of shutting down and narrowing down and getting inside a little bubble, a little echo chamber. And they aren't exposed to that much diversity of opinion outside of it. And although they're aware that there's diversity of opinion outside of it, you can say, well, here's how our church is handling, the COVID issue, but here's these other churches doing this, or here's our church's response to the BLM, but here's other churches. That doesn't help, because right now we've kind of tribalized the landscape. And so if you try to point and say, well, look, there is some diversity within the church. Here's some other churches doing it differently. It's like, oh, they're just doing that because they're liberals or because they're Trump voters or whatever, right? And so we kind of write off everybody who's not like us right now. But it's not so easy to do that with, John Calvin or Augustine. They obviously weren't Trump voters, and I'm not really interested in trying to ask the question of would they have been if they were alive now. They lived in a different context. They faced different questions. They were being faithful to God in their own context. And by just widening the sphere a little bit and being like, hey, remember, these are part of the family of God too. These are your brothers and sisters. Let's just kind of zoom out from our own immediate concerns a little bit and try to find some reference points in the experience of the church in the past where they were dealing with analogous issues, and just to expose people to some of that, and then saying, oh, that's weird. They handle things very differently than we would handle things. Even on this issue of freedom of speech, they were much more comfortable with persecuting heretics, and just that awareness of, well, we don't necessarily have to agree with what they did, but it's kind of startling. Oh, that's a very different assumptions. And yet those are fellow Christians too, who deserve respect. And hopefully that kind of cracks the mental door open a little bit and makes people realize, okay, hang on a second. My sense of the only faithful Christian response right now is to do X might be a little narrow-minded, I think that's, by going to history, you're appealing to people who are outside of our immediate partisan context, so they can't just be blown off. And if you can get Christians to recognize there is a wider world of Christian faithfulness, perhaps, than their own current bubble, then that can help at least give some breathing space in some of these conversations.
Love it. Thanks so much, Brad.
Yeah.
I love it too, because it's like you build a case that everyone needs a mentor that is dead, essentially.
Right.
Or a few mentors that have gone before. But well, for all those that feel like we're just scratching the surface on this topic and want to learn more, how can people follow along with your work, Brad?
Yeah, well, my work here, a lot of it is done through the organization, the Davenant Institute, which is really engaged in this kind of trying to renew Christian wisdom today by recovering a sense of our Christian past and exposing people to the riches of our tradition and how much it can actually inform and invigorate current Christian discipleship. So check out davenantinstitute.org. We have a magazine, Ad Fontes Journal, at fontesjournal.com, where I have a blog. I'll also be starting in October as an opinion columnist for World Magazine. So you can check out World Opinions for my weekly rants. So
I love it. Well, this has been great. Thanks for your time. And we'll link to all this in the show notes for those listening and watching. And until next time. Wow. Thanks again to Brad for taking us deep into these topics. Who knew how important political theory could be for pastors?
I know. The conversation had some real weight to it, but the reality is that these are weighty questions that are in the midst of many pastors. We're living in the middle of a complex age, and one where, for some people, the very definitions of truth and freedom are up for grabs, and we don't want to leave that up to just political pundits or talking heads or our social media feeds. It really is helpful to have some input from someone who is passionate and knowledgeable on the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even today, our conviction at Subsplash is that the truth of Jesus through the life of the local church is the greatest source of hope and joy for our world. And we hope that today's episode brought clarity to some big issues facing the church. And we'd love to partner with you as you navigate these times to really help your church overcome distraction and disconnection through technology that's built for ministry from the ground up.
That's right. Remember, you can get started with Subsplash Media today at subsplash.com/free speech. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Equip and Engage, where we'll continue to have conversations about the most important challenges facing the church. Thanks for listening today, and we'll catch you next time.